What is consent? In general, it means that we shouldn't do things to others that they don't want or agree to, that we should ask before we do things, and that we have a right to not having people do things to us that we don't want. Consent is so important in the context of sex. But where did the idea of consent even come from? We've become really used to the idea that anything sexual that happens that isn't completely consensual is bad. And of course, that's true. But historically, this has been an incredibly murky area. In ancient times, rape and assault were considered acceptable if it was wartime. Depending on the civilization, poor women, children, sex workers, servants, and other marginalized communities could have their consent violated without most people caring at all. And up until the 1970s, it was legal and even socially acceptable for a husband to force himself on his wife. As recently as the 90s, popular culture offered a picture of sexual connections between young people in which coercion, deception, and inebriation were not just tolerated, but expected. And today, many people still tolerate sexual assault, so long as it's done to people we don't deem worthy of protection, like sex workers or trans women, or even young people at parties. Many of us even laugh about it when we make jokes about men in prison dropping the soap, an indication that some of us still accept rape as a form of justice. The field of consent really came out of the medical area, not the sexual arena. For hundreds of years, philosophers and medical professionals debated the individual's right to determine what happened to their body and how informed a person had to be about the nature of a procedure, the possible side effects, or other risks in order to actually consent to it. In the 70s and 80s, in particular on college campuses, the idea that sex that wasn't consensual, but also wasn't physically violent, began to be understood as harmful. The reality of date rape, of the various reasons a person might have not to physically resist unwanted advances, or even not to say no, began to be understood. And these ideas began to grow and spread. And at the same time, the idea of sex positivity became way more mainstream. Kink clubs, swinger societies, sex parties became less stigmatized. Gay people and queer lifestyles became more mainstream. And hookup culture became the norm for young people's forays into sexuality. And as sex was drawn into public consciousness, consent-focused policies were created on college campuses, in states, and elsewhere, with the goal of preventing harm. In 2017, the Me Too movement drew mainstream attention to the way that consent is often clouded by power, to all the ways that, in particular, men in power use coercion or pressure to get sex, and all the ways that people, in particular women, might say yes or go along with something that they aren't consenting to. More recently, new standards for what constitutes consent have been put forth. And young people in the past were taught, no means no, a phrase meant to address coercion and pestering. Today, young people are taught that anything that's not a hell yes is a no, a phrase meant to focus on the necessity of mutual enthusiasm. And yet still, the definition of what constitutes a consent violation differs across countries, states, college campuses, even among friend groups and norms in different communities. And despite all the focus on consent, sexual harm feels more pervasive today than ever. In my practice supporting men to take accountability following sexual harm, I never see anyone who doesn't care about consent or who thinks sexual assault is acceptable. And yet, we are still causing so much harm. Across the country, today, we are hurting each other through sex. And most of the time, the people doing the hurting have no idea. What's going on? Why isn't consent culture keeping us safe?